Sorry, before we start, and then we'll get into the exciting content. A couple of things from an RMA perspective. Please note that the RMA does promote diversity of opinion as it contributes to a better understanding of risk principles and risk management. Members, please do take care when republishing any view that may have been expressed at an event, such as the event today. And finally, any opinions or insights that are presented today by our speakers, Andrew, for example, are their individual opinions and may not reflect the opinion of either our members or RMA Australia. So I might leave it there and pass on and welcome our very privileged guest here today, Andrew Hinchliff.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you very much. It's a great honour to be here today. Thank you for inviting me, and good day to everybody out there.
Fantastic. So, Andrew, let me just count back the time. I think we are at 8 months in the role. Is that correct?
We are indeed.
So, obvious question, not a loaded question, but how are you enjoying it?
I'm loving it. I mean, I really am. And, I get asked a little bit because it's the first time I'm in the risk management fraternity. I've always dealt with risk through my career. I'm happy to talk about that, but it's the first time in the risk management fraternity. And I get asked the question a lot. And I'd say my response is typically, this would be the most intellectually stimulating job I think I've ever had in terms of the breadth and the depth, in particular with what's going on around the world. So for that reason, I'm loving it. I'm loving the different context it gives me as well. So, yeah, very enjoyable so far.
Fantastic. And obviously, prior to this role, you were in a group exec role for institutional banking and markets for some time. So just interested to hear the transition from, say, the business over to risk. How have you found that?
Yeah, good. I mean, look, I've got a talented group of people that are helping me understand the dimensions of risk, and I've got a very supportive board and executive leadership team. So that's going very well. I think it is quite amazing when you shift your context and you change hats, how your view of the world can change depending on who your stakeholders are. And I felt like I've always owned the risk being in the business. And I've tried to do that well, whether it be sort of in global markets or IB&M. I think when you're tasked with, keeping the organisation and the board safe, even though you've been around that executive leadership team for a long time and had all access to the papers and read the papers, it's very different when you're tasked with protecting the bank and the people that are working for you protecting the bank. So your context shift and the things that worry you or keep you up at night, all of a sudden shift as well. So, I've had to shift that context, and that's probably one of the things that I've had to probably adjust to the most, in particular amongst the leadership team, frankly, where they're used to seeing you with one hat on and now all of a sudden you've got a different hat. So your relationships naturally change as well.
And I guess there's been a lot of things to focus on and prioritise since you've stepped in the role. Anything top of mind, let's say in the first 6 months, you've had to put at the top of your to-do list, perhaps?
Many things. And I think the starting point for me was truly trying to understand all of my important stakeholders, which are just sort of outlined there as kind of the business units, and it's the regulators, and it's the board, and it's sort of, my boss and the executive leadership team and your people. And so you understand all of those stakeholders and you try and understand their context first and foremost. And I think importantly, you've got to understand what's our external and internal context as well. And this is, I suppose, relevant to all of you listening in. I mean, your external context is, like nothing we've seen before in many ways. I mean, the political environment is fraught around the world, the geopolitical environment. You've got, rapid technology, changes. You've certainly got greater inequality happening around the world. Huge uncertainty around macroeconomic environment and economic environment. And, it's an extremely challenging environment, both strategically as well as from a financial and non-financial risk perspective. So your starting point is trying to understand that context and understand your stakeholders. And then once you do that, you quickly work out where your priorities are. And certainly for us, we're focused a lot on resilience, as I'm sure many are here, the broader church of economic crime. AI as an example, technology modernisation, as well as sort of the broader financial environment at the moment and how to make sense of it.
Yeah. And interesting, obviously, you touched on AI. I mean, obviously, it's the buzzword of the moment, isn't it? It's very topical, not just within, obviously, financial services or our industry, but obviously a lot broader than that. But just interested, I guess, in your views, friend or foe AI?
Well, definitively friend. Well, whether it's a friend or a foe, it doesn't matter. It's here.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's coming at speed. So therefore, you've got to work out how best to use AI. It is an extraordinary technology. I mean, you hear it described as sort of the beginning of the fourth industrial revolution in terms of what it can do, and you throw in a lot of compute power on that, and it can solve some of the world's most complex problems. So in that instance, it's a friend. It can help us manage risks, like we've never been able to do, and make sense of the organisation, like we've never been able to solve customer problems, like we've never been able to do. But like any sort of new technology or new process, it has the ability to introduce new risks, but also magnify other risks as well. And I think about some of that, broader economic crime, be it cyber or frauds or scams. There's a lot of different vectors that get enabled by AI. So it's here, it's moving like unbelievably quickly. The strategic risks are real, and it's one of the things that we're trying to make sense of the most within CBA, not only for the benefit of sort of CBA and our customers, but also I think as Australia's largest organisation, there's an important role for us to play as it relates to the economy and the Australian landscape, frankly.
Mm. And I think closely linked to AI is sort of data and analytics. So just kind of interested in particularly, let's say from a CBA perspective, how we're leveraging data and analytics to really sort of drive better decision making and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, the organisation of your data is essential to being able to power AI, and so we're doing a lot of work in terms of organising our data. And some would have seen the press of moving our core banking to the cloud a couple of weeks ago, which is all part of that sort of modernisation of technology and data to enable AI use cases and delivery. And so there's a lot of work to do on data. I mean, from a risk perspective. And I'm fortunate at being a CRO of Australia's largest bank in that we get, the risk function is the biggest consumer of data in the organisation. I mean, it's a really important role for us to ingest as much data as we can, and then to make sense of kind of the system of CBA and the external system to help, guide the organisation through to good risk outcomes. And so data is everything. Your organisation, if your data is never good enough, I think if you ask any bank around the world, you're always wrestling with sort of improvements in your data foundations, which we've got to continue to do as well. As somebody sort of said, where sometimes banks are rich on data but very low on insights. And I think sort of the magic for some of the things that we want to accomplish is how do we get real insights into that data, make real sense of the system. And AI certainly got the ability to help us do that as well.
Yeah. And I think another, obviously, very front of mind for CBA and obviously more broadly is cyber threats. And I think you touched on it earlier. I think the volume and velocity continues to be real, and the sophistication certainly of some of these threats are very real. So how is CBA sort of strengthening its resilience posture?
I mean, resilience is such a broad church, of which cyber is sort of, one, let's call it vulnerability to broader resilience. And there's naturally process resilience and technology resilience and data resilience and, geopolitical resilience and all these sorts of things that we can sort of focus on. But it's important that you understand where, across all of those various vectors, your single points of failure can ultimately be, and then how do you protect against those? And now as it relates to cyber, naturally you want to, protect, entries into your environment, make sure you've only got entities or people or machines dealing within the CBA system that you want to, minimising the ability to move around within the system when you do, make sure you've got good, segregation of duties, good encryption of your data, know where your data is, and then also be able to, in a worst case scenario, rebuild your systems from scratch if you absolutely need to, and recover them, which basically means you need good restoration of data and good storage of data and multiple different environments to be able to operate your data and technology in. So we do a lot of work across all those various elements, and it's one of those things that it will never stop.
Yeah, absolutely. Quite similar to is I guess another focus is all around ESG risks, and I guess the importance of not having that set to the side, but really sort of integrating that into the enterprise risk management framework. So I guess from CBA's perspective, anything you can share on how we're integrating that really effectively and efficiently and sort of delivering better outcomes in the process?
Yeah, I mean, look, an important word to use there is framework. Is one of the things I've learned within the risk management function, but also just being around sort of the CBA executive leadership team for a long time, is in order to sort of ensure there's consistent risk management across an organisation of 50,000 people, you need frameworks. You need to think things on an industrial scale that are going to be adopted right down through the organisation, and ESG is no different, AI is no different, data is no different. So having a good risk management framework, very important. Along with sort of good independent assurance. Now, in terms of relates to sort of ESG, that's a broad church in its own right. I mean, most would sort of focus in on probably the environment sector, which has probably been most acute over recent years. And if I could break that into many areas, but one of the important areas for the bank is allocating capital into the economy. And one of the things we do is, for any organisation that's sort of over $1.5 million in borrowings from us, we use an ESG tool as an example that exists in the Line 1 frames area, where they assess every business we lend to for essentially ESG risk. And then Line 2 will provide some sort of assurance. We do physical stress tests on all of that. As well, we try and follow glide paths as it relates to net zero. And we try and allocate capital to areas that we think are going to be aligned with a broader, sustainable economy that meets community expectations, and that's a strategic as well as sort of managing your broader risks.
I mean, we've talked a lot about, I guess, very topical, front of mind areas of focus or risks today. Is there anything that you think, let's say, in the Australian economy sector that is a little bit underrated from a risk perspective? Something perhaps that you go, oh, no one's really thinking that that's a big deal, but actually I think that is an emerging risk or something that we should be a little concerned about.
I don't know how many. I don't know what everybody's thinking out there, but what I would say is, I'm on the board of a global CRO body, and the things that I was worried about pleasingly were all the things that they were worried about, and therefore I think it's probably the things that you're worried about. And so I think that's healthy because it means we're collectively trying to solve the problem. I do worry about dependencies on international counterparts. There's quite a bit of single point of failure, in particular sort of around sort of, large technology companies, many would be on similar sort of cloud environments. A lot of that can be well managed at the moment, but I think over time that becomes more heightened unless we sort of do something as a country. So if you think about a world of moving to AI, where we become highly dependent on large language models from a few US tech providers, and it is a winner-takes-all type environment as it relates to sort of the arms race globally in that area, there's a lot of dependency that we can build up on particular providers of that unless we are thoughtful, which I know the government is trying to be thoughtful around how best to do this. It leaves you open to sort of leverage, and we're in a very uncertain world at the moment. Economically, we've seen different sort of postures around administrations around the world, and you always want to be able to be in control in your own destiny. So I worry a little bit about the speed to technology and innovation, which is necessary from a strategic perspective, leaves us open to vulnerabilities and single points of failure.
Yeah. I think probably moves to the whole concept of risk management and how it is constantly evolving. And I guess even if we take your role as CRO, it would be very different today, say to 10, 15, 20 years ago. So how do you see the role of risk management evolving over the course of sort of the next few years in this rapidly changing, I guess, and complex environment?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I mean, if you think of the various cycles, I suppose, of risk as opposed to just the CRO, but certainly from a bank, it was predominantly financially focused for a long, long period of time. And then, the financial crisis came along and it forced us to really focus on the financial risk, capital adequacy and liquidity and all these sorts of things and models, which we've done very, very well. Keep working on that. But then obviously the non-financials came along cyber, and in Australia we had our own Royal Commission. CBA itself had its own prudential inquiry into some of our shortcomings, which led to a deep focus on all the various non-financial risks, which I think continue to be probably the biggest focus today. I think some of these things are helped, as I mentioned at the beginning, but also potentially worsened by the advent of AI. And rapid sort of tech innovation. So where do I think kind of the CRO and risk will have to focus on going forward? I think we're all going to have to be very technology, data, AI literate. We're going to have to be able to use the tools, I think, to help manage risk. We're going to have to provide necessary assurance while the business is able to run fast and solve customer problems. Which means that I think the skill set is going to have to shift and the way we operate is going to have to shift.
Yeah.
And I think many of the things that we do today potentially can be dealt with via technology and AI, leaving sort of risk professionals to focus on the extremely complex and making sense of the system.
Yeah. Shifting topics slightly. Risk culture, again, really, really important. I know as an organisation at CBA, it's something that we are continually looking to strengthen. So I think certainly from my perspective, I think we've come a huge way. Just interested in your thoughts on what it takes, and particularly, I guess, different insight you might bring to the role on fostering a good, strong risk culture. Sort of any...
It's such a good question, but it'd be probably one of the most complicated questions and topics, because you have to define what good risk culture is, and that can mean many things to different people. Risk culture is certainly not about saying no to every single risk, as an example, or having zero tolerance around every non-financial risk. Ultimately, it's about sort of the beliefs and the values of our people to be able to identify, monitor, manage risks of all sorts, which is equally strategic risk, financial and non-financial risks. And so, one of the very good things about a good risk culture is being able to surface the information, but really quickly, and make decisions holding all of those potential risks equally. There's no point in us having zero non-financial risk, but missing out strategically. And so I think the tough thing about risk culture and culture in general, it's a little bit like catching smoke. You can't quite see it or touch it. You've got to work really hard to uncover what it actually is, and you've got to keep working hard at it. It's one of those things that can drift over time unless you work at it, especially with a rapidly changing external environment. And so it's the right question, and a lot of work that we're doing on it.
Yeah. I think you spoke about it earlier, and I guess I've always wondered this myself, is particularly in this role, you spend a lot of time with boards and a lot of time with regulators, and I think sometimes their expectations don't always line up. So I guess for all the risk professionals on the line, certainly I would benefit as well. Any sort of strategic insights you can provide, given all the time that you do spend with that community, how to be sort of more effective and engaging in that sense?
Well, I think certainly every one of those stakeholders will have their own context. And I think one of the important, attributes of any leader CRO or any other group executive or leader in general is being able to bridge the gap between stakeholders. And to do that, you need to be able to understand everybody's context. And I think as soon as you can do that, you've got a chance of bridging that context. And then, one of the important things I think is also to break down complicated topics into the simple, being able to explain things in simple terms, because some of these topics that we're talking about at the micro level can get extremely complicated. But if you understand their context and then explain things in that context in a simple way, that's helpful. I think the other thing is to be able to garner trust. And, transparency, I think, is key. We talked about that culture of being able to flow information up through the organisation or out to regulators, being able to accept feedback and being able to do something about areas where we've got concerns quickly, I think builds transparency and it builds trust. And I think that's a really important thing in terms of managing that.
I think one area of focus for the board and the regulators particularly is this whole customer vulnerability, or those customers in vulnerable circumstances. And I think obviously we've been through a pretty tough time in the economy, obviously cost of living crisis, had lots of inflationary pressures and that sort of thing. And I know CBA has done a tremendous job to help support our customers, particularly those that are in those more vulnerable circumstances. But I guess just interested in your views in the role that risk might play to kind of support customers in those sorts of situations. It might even be around the frameworks, policies, processes, systems, etc. But yeah, that's probably one thing I think is top of mind when you get into the boardroom or in front of the regulator.
Yeah, I mean, look, mentioned sort of inequality sort of earlier on. I mean, there's always customers that are either vulnerable or less well off than others. I mean, it doesn't need to be also a permanent vulnerability. I think we all go through different sort of stages in our life cycle, and we can be vulnerable at different points in our life cycle. I think the important thing is that, we use the information available to us and empathetic and open enough to sort of listen for those vulnerabilities and help our customers through those more difficult times. And I think, it's natural that we sort of bucket sort of vulnerabilities into key cohorts of customers, but I think sort of going forward, you'll be trying to sort of rely on this hyper-personalisation to understand where you are in a certain part of your life cycle. So I think that's important and is, always going to be there and potentially gets worse before it gets better in that regard. So, I think the role that risk can play is understanding kind of the end-to-end customer journey. Now, quite often, sometimes we've got policies, for example, that we may own that are for the best intentions designed to protect the organisation or customers from certain outcomes. Now, sometimes they can have perverse consequences to those policies, and if you apply the right judgment to the application of those policies, you can end up with a far better customer outcome, which I think risk professionals need to be open to dealing with.
Yeah. I think, yes, certainly I agree. And anything we can do to help simplify some of those policies and processes, I think that's a fairly unique ask of most people who are consuming these across the various organisations. We are going to go to some questions shortly in the chat, so I will ask people to start putting any questions they have for Andrew in the Q&A. But before we do that, probably just shifting gears a little bit, talking a bit about you as not maybe the risk professional. So given you're the head of risk of CBA, tell me, you probably don't take a lot of risks in your personal life, but is there anything that you've taken a risk and backed yourself in your personal life and, it's been the best thing ever that's really paid off?
Well, I ride a bike. It feels like it's high risk, so so probably not the best.
Is it one of those e-bikes?
No, it's not a proper road bike. Yeah, so it doesn't feel like good risk mitigation for sure. But risk for my personal life, or risk, maybe career-wise. I think maybe originally applying for the group executive role, back before I got to this particular role. And it's always interesting putting yourself out there. You're never quite sure whether you're going to get a particular role. And so maybe it applies to this one as well. And, and maybe at the time I was potentially even green as a group executive. There was probably a risk on my behalf going for it, and maybe a risk on Matt's behalf at the time appointing me to it. And it seems to have worked out all right so far. We'll see how this particular role goes, but
Yeah, I think that's a good reflection actually, because it's like with any role, you sort of lots of self-doubt at times can sort of fill your thoughts. So I think it is absolutely the right thing. Take a risk and back yourself, and who knows, you could be the CRO at CBA.
You never know where life takes you. But I think unless you put yourself in uncomfortable positions, you never really quite develop. And I think that's probably a good example where it did, and so far it's worked out.
Yeah. And if you weren't, let's say, in the role that you are today, is there any particular career that you think, gee, I would have loved to have done that?
Oh, I love my sport. I played soccer and cricket at high levels. I would have loved to have been a professional footballer or of some sort. I mean, and I never would have made it to that level, but dreams. I love the theatre of sport. I love watching them excel, and I'd often wish that was me on that big stage sometimes. But I think thankfully I got plenty of knee injuries early on in my career, which sort of forced me down a career path that's allowed me to be successful in this space. So yeah.
Oh, fantastic. All right. Well, we might thank you for answering all those questions. Really appreciate the candid and conversation. I might just go to the chat now and the Q&A for any questions. Yeah. Just refreshing. Lovely. Here we go. Terrific. It's quite a few actually. Question here around measuring. How is CBA? So on the topic of AI, I think again it is quite an area of interest for most people. But how is CBA measuring the success of AI in risk management?
In risk management, I'd say it's still early in terms of measuring the success. I mean, we certainly try and measure adverse consequences of where we may have poor customer outcomes as a result of AI and deployment. So naturally, you'll monitor things such as customer complaints or monitor the effectiveness of certain models to the extent they haven't performed as they are. So there's elements of that. We provide model validation, for all of our models at the moment. So making sure they're going to work before they go into production. You try and look at, either the efficacy of your models, but also how we're sort of using AI for elements of economic crime. So how do we mitigate, for example, cyber? We do a lot of work around frauds and scams, where we've been a long-term user of AI, and that's only progressing more with Gen AI, where I can think we've probably cut frauds and scams for our customers by something like, I'm going to say, 50% over the long course of the last year or two. And I'd say that'd be things, using AI and models in general to sort of mitigate that. So it's a big area for us.
Yeah. And will continue to be, obviously. I think, as you say, that threat's certainly not going away. Great question here. Your background is heavily weighted towards financial and strategic risk. But how have you thought about sort of non-financial risk, given it can be, less black and white? So how do you sort of ensure you get the best outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, non-financial risk is really difficult. And as I sort of said at the beginning, I think you could probably throw an infinite amount of resources at this space and still not necessarily mitigate all of it. I mean, I think as an organisation, we spend something in the order of $900 million a year on, cyber, fraud, scams, financial crime, and we still feel like we're constantly chasing our tail on that particular space. I mean, yeah, I've come up through most of my career through the financial space, but it's one of the great gifts, I suppose, in that I joined this ELT in 2018, when CBA, and the other banks had just come through the Royal Commission. We had our own APRA inquiry into CBA's culture. So we've had to build heavily our risk culture that we have today, as well as truly understand our risk frameworks and our non-financial risks. So I've been sort of at the seat of the table and driving that organisational transformation, which has helped. But now we're on to the next phase of that, which is AI and models and the like.
Yeah. And I also was at CBA at that time, and I must admit it was volume and velocity, wasn't it? Well, it was very transformational, but
Absolutely.
yeah. Question here, I think actually this is a really good one. Someone who spent most of their time in a line one or business role, any sort of valuable insight for risk professionals from that sort of line one or business mindset you can pass on.
Yeah, I mean, certainly from my time in line one, what did I always hope for from risk, and got in spades in certain areas, but where it frustrated me, where I didn't get it, where it was more around the administration of risk, around the judgment of risk, and the pragmatic outcomes of what is a good risk outcome. And, and I think part of the reason I'm in the role that I am at the moment is being able to sort of help impart what, good judgment and strategic risk actually is. I mean, I think to the extent that we're in the business of administrating risk, and box ticking, that is a bad risk culture and bad outcomes for the business. And so it's about judgment. It's about managing the various trade-offs that inevitably have to happen, and therefore it's about leadership. And when you see it done from the risk function, and by the way, from a business perspective, what I valued a lot from my CRO and the risk function of that was, I think you're really good. I'm confident in my ability to make this decision, but I need you to test me. I need you to keep me safe, be the black hat here. And if they were really good at their job and they're able to provide that judgment, it's extremely helpful for me as a business owner.
Yeah. And I think certainly line one and line two are working really, really well together, certainly from a CBA perspective, having worked in both line one and line two myself. It is good to have that constructive challenge, and I think we really got that right balance here. So it's good to hear those views. And obviously, a sense of commerciality and pragmatism when we're sort of having those conversations, as you said, because we are in a business and we will take some risks, but it has to be, as you say, measured and thought through. So,
and by definition, as you say, the tension has to be there. That's how the organisation stays safe, but it's got to be done in the right way, at the right level, and I'd agree it's done well.
Yeah. Question here around ANZ's misconduct. So for those that are joining the call from ANZ, so obviously affecting tens of thousands of customers, especially those in hardship or dealing with deceased estates. So just a question around CBA's risk frameworks and just how and I think we've spoken a little bit about it already, but protecting vulnerable customers and are not just sort of reactive compliance measures that are put in place after the fact.
Yeah, I mean, look, I won't comment too much on ANZ for our colleagues, but as I said before, I think risk culture is something that we've got to continue to work at CBA. We're doing our own work on all of those things. They're big, complicated systems. You've got to keep the customer at the centre of everything you're doing.
Yeah.
You need to maintain transparency, and I think importantly, you need to identify where you've got incidents and issues and run towards those as quickly as you possibly can and fix them. And whether you're a bank or you're in any other organisation, kind of listen to your customers and work out how to sort of fix and report transparently with the regulators. So, we've been there ourselves, and we've got our own work to do as well.
Yeah. Question around insurance cover being quite difficult to secure. Or very, very expensive, and I think particularly in some locations. So, and I know we've seen our own customers impacted, let's say, through drought or floods. So how do you deal with situations where cover isn't in place?
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, back to one of the risks that you identified as emerging, for example, I mean, the cost of insurance is increasing quite a lot. Climate could be a key reason of that. There's either going to be no insurance or underinsurance. It's an important, certainly, area for us to keep an eye on. We have an expectation there's insurance before we provide mortgages, as an example. But equally, it can be difficult sometimes to continue to monitor and ask people to comply with some of that, depending on what their cost of living actually is and what it means for their various valuations of the property. So it's a complicated issue that I think we've got to continue to certainly keep an eye on from a banking perspective, but I think important from an, let's call it a tail risk. You only had to look at the US, I think, where they had the bushfires over there, and large parts of the population were well underinsured in terms of their property, and I suspect Australia would be somewhat similar.
Yeah. And a great question here just around, and I think we touched on this earlier, just around the tension sometimes it's in the system, and just a question around how the bank's risk appetite aligns with the overall strategy and objectives.
Yeah, I mean, that's a constant discussion, and especially with such a let's call it a dynamic external environment at the moment. And I think you've just got to constantly calibrate. And certainly one of the things that I think about, one of the changes that we've tried to make within CBA, we used to have long dated business unit strategies. We now sort of refresh those strategies regularly. The operating cadence of the organisation has shifted in terms of the way we drive change through the organisation through crews and scrums and quarterly business reviews. So we're far more dynamic in the way we think about strategy, and then the way we sort of flow reporting through to the board around what are the key risk indicators and how do they affect risk appetite given this strategy is a constant discussion at every single board. And so all those things have to marry up properly, and there's trade-offs across all of that. Yeah.
And I think you're right, it is dynamic, it's constantly changing and evolving, and this is why I guess we talked about data and analytics, and being able to deliver those real-time insights is quite critical to getting that those great outcomes, not only for us, of course, but for our customers most importantly.
Yeah.
Question here around any practical approaches or lessons learned that you think would be valuable for others in the industry. So quite a broad question, I guess, but maybe some insights you've learned along the way in this role that you think would be helpful for others.
Yeah, I try to do a lot of breakfasts, for example, a lot of MORs or manager once removed conversation with breakfast with sort of people in the business. I do a lot of deep dives into specific areas where I'm trying to learn more on. It could be a topic like AI, it could be trying to understand our collections area, for example, or small business lending or model validation or whatever it is. You've got to pick the topics, and I think you've got to go deep and understand the details and try and learn as much as you possibly can. I think going back to what I was speaking before, once you do that, you at least understand context. You understand where you've got good capabilities, good talent density, good leadership skills. And once you kind of understand that and you know enough of the questions to ask, then I think you can sort of let that area go for a while. Do you know what I mean? But it's important to sort of go deep on these areas. Very hard to sort of manage from 50,000 feet.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean you need to micromanage, but it means you need to at least understand what's happening.
Yeah. And a good career question for you. We've got quite a few line one risk professionals actually on the call, and they're asking for some career advice, transitioning, let's say, from a line one role to a line two or line three role. Any sort of suggestions from their perspective you could share?
Well, I certainly would never pigeon yourself. Firstly, I'll caveat this. I never thought of myself moving. I've never been a big planner of my career, and I never thought of myself, as a deliberate plan to go into line two. But what I've always been open to is if I do my job as best as I possibly can, I'll allow fate and the organisation to pull me to the right areas, and so that's probably point one. And related to that, I don't think you ever want to remove optionality. You should be open to everything and anything and have as many conversations and do as many informational conversations as you possibly can. I think important for all the risk professionals in here as well as the business professionals, I think, I think good business professionals are increasingly going to be, people who understand the risk function. And I think importantly, good risk professionals are going to be good people who understand the business function.
Yeah.
And if we want to go quickly, for example, on tech and AI,
yeah,
there's no good in hiring enormous amounts of tech and AI people, for example, if the risk management function doesn't necessarily understand what you're trying to do.
Yes.
So the whole machine has to move in unison, and you need
Yes.
talent density in both areas.
yeah.
And they need to be rotated through there. So be open to everything would be my suggestion.
Yeah, that's great advice. I think you mentioned it earlier too. One of the key areas of focus for you in the first 6 months was all around meeting your stakeholders. So I think certainly getting around, having those good conversations, networking, I think is always important too. So
Really important.
Question around risk professionals, what they should do in your mind, more of and less of. We sort of touched on a few of these key themes, but
Yeah, more of, I think, listening and learning, because I think that builds context. Yeah, I think important to risk culture is a learn-it-all sort of culture. You never want to be a know-it-all culture, and there'd be nothing more infuriating from when I was in a business at any point in my career where I get somebody from sort of the risk function turn up who was a know-it-all and not necessarily open or listening to sort of context or feedback or was an immovable force. And so, I think certainly in promoting a learn it all and listening type of culture, I think is extremely important. So I think that's probably where you can do. It's probably a bit of do more of and do less of, all in the same sort of answer, I think.
yeah. There's a question around obviously just the volume of information out there, and it's not necessarily just about AI, it's just about any topic in general. And I think as a risk professional, or I guess any professional really in any role, you sort of just the constant struggle to stay on top of that information and that content so you can have that context. But question around any practical tips that you could recommend around sort of, I guess AI is a good one, hitting Copilot to summarise documents, board packs, etc., but to save a bit of time. But any tips you could recommend on how to sort of stay on top of all the information that's out there?
No, I mean, certainly AI, democratises knowledge like we've never seen it before. So you've got the ability to go harder and faster at sort of any topic that you want, so which is helpful. But I mean, the reality is the volume of information coming at us has been coming at us for quite some time. And I think, the question's the right one is, well, how do you make sense of it all? So what I would say is, I do more reading in this particular job than I've ever done in my entire life. I mean, it is constant and thoroughly intellectually stimulating stuff. I think the true magic comes in, though, I think for any leader or executive around being able to synthesize all of that information into a message that is clearly understood and is relevant and matters. Because there's a lot of noise in the system as well, and getting rid of the noise and system thinking, I think, is rare and important. And I think it can define good leaders to the extent that they're good system thinkers, which means able to synthesize all that information. And no doubt technology can help us do that better than ever.
Yeah. We have time for just a couple more questions, so thank you again. I think question here around the increasing complexity of stakeholder expectations, and we sort of touched on this again, but around whether it's boards or regulators, but how do you approach sort of simplifying the narrative? And I think that's really important, because sometimes when you get into conversations, you can quickly slip into kind of risky type conversation, and you throw the acronyms and all that sort of thing, and you've pretty much lost your audience. But yeah, any sort of tips you can provide in terms of simplifying that sort of narrative, just to be more impactful for those sorts of audiences?
Yeah, it goes a little bit to what I was saying there. I think if you're into sort of specific details or acronyms or jargon, it's a dangerous place to be. I mean, I think you got to, as I said, you got to understand their context, put yourself in their shoes. What are they trying to understand? At what sort of level? And a little bit like, any speaking engagement, whether it be sort of around a boardroom or in front of sort of 1,000 people, sort of know your audience, for example, and understand what's in it for them. That's always a very helpful starting point. I think as it relates to sort of regulators and boards and frankly community and sometimes there's not, sometimes there's a lot of alignment between what we're all trying to do, as in we all want to sort of keep the system safe. We all want good customer outcomes. We all want a profitable sort of banking sector as an example. Most wouldn't disagree with any of those sorts of things. It just comes down to, well, where is the friction at the boundaries? And that's where, understanding every customer stakeholder at those boundaries of stakeholder expectations is important.
Yeah.
So, big picture, I think, is important. Start there and then sort of drill down to the details if needed.
Yeah. I think, that's absolutely right, isn't it? Know your audience is key. So probably just a final question, just one, I guess, a bit more on the personal front. Is there a moment in your career that has really shaped your approach to risk leadership?
Look, I certainly, there's probably a couple. I mean, I remember the embarrassments internally, externally on as CBA, the Royal Commission. I mean, I think that stuck with me. I was only sort of a couple of years in, I think, at that point when that actually happened, and sort of it really stood out to me how when things go really wrong in terms of missing expectations, community expectations, call it non-financial risk culture, when you miss the mark on that, how bad it can be. And so that's an important thing that stuck with me, and an important part of paranoia. I always remember one of the early times when I went to the board as well, which is pre all of that. And I was sort of representing global markets at that time as well. And it was a really poor audit report, and I was brand new sort of in there. And I remember having the riot read to me at the time, which was kind of helpful because it set the expectations around what am I meant to do in terms of managing risk. So it was a helpful message, but I do remember feedback in that. I remember owning it in the room as well in terms of the transparency of the response and sort of the accountability that I took for it, even though I didn't necessarily need to at the time. Came back in very positive feedback, and it's always struck me as well. Kind of own it. I mean, I think is helpful.
Yeah. I think, absolutely. And I think it's to your point that you mentioned before was sometimes these uncomfortable situations you end up in actually grow and develop from that, and sort of then you can pass those lessons on to others. So difficult at the time, I know. I think we've all been there, but certainly, I think important for everyone's growth and development. I think that we're almost at time. Maybe, do you mind if we just have one final question?
No, sure.
And then we will let you go. And again, I think it's just coming up quite a lot in the chat here is just, it all comes down to emerging risks. And I think, again, it's like how are we getting ahead of the curve? It's just constantly changing. And I think you did talk about it, and you talked about the board and sort of the various discussions you have as a leadership team being dynamic and agile. But just I guess people are saying, it's just a constant, like what more can we be doing as risk professionals to kind of get ahead of what's coming our way so we can sort of probably more proactively manage the fallout or not from some of these situations.
Yeah, I mean, and look, I think that's probably at the heart of what the risk management function should do. I mean, hopefully sort of through automation, control automation and sort of good risk management frameworks, the BAU of risk management is largely helped through technology.
Mm-hmm.
Which basically leaves the risk professionals to do the horizon scanning, which is understanding what's coming at us externally, strategically, regulatory, geopolitically, and then I think we end up doing a really good job when we're forward-looking. We're thinking about that horizon and working out how do we shift the organisation to manage the business and the strategy within the guardrails of a changing environment. And I think that's the real skill set of a risk management professional, and you kind of need to have a mindset which is we're going to have to be agile. We're going to have to work out, depending on what the environment actually is, as an organisation, we've got to build that sort of agility into the system, but we've got to be willing to move, and we've got to be bringing the outside in. Frankly, if we're managing risk in a vacuum, it's a very dangerous place to be. You've got to be looking externally.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for your time today. I know I really found the session insightful and the questions. Obviously, there's actually so many more on the chat that I can't get through, but yeah, I think it's certainly a very interesting time to be in risk. Probably slightly biased, but I think certainly, you know, no matter what organisation or industry you're in, I think there's a lot going on and a lot for us to continue to learn and learn as we sort of grow as our own careers. But thank you. You've been really generous with your time and your insights. So thank you everyone online for joining. I think we had quite a number of people. I think it got up to around 900 in the end, but please join in for the next session that's being held on the 23rd of October. That is with Westpac's Chief Economist, Lucy Ellis. She might have some news on interest rates perhaps at that point. And obviously there will be a feedback request that will come out to everyone online post the session. So please, if you have an opportunity, would love to hear that feedback. But other than that, thank you once again and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you very much.